In the 600s, the Byzantine Empire had worn itself out fighting the Parthians in Persia, or that lived in Persia, because the Byzantines were so weak, and so were the Romans in the West. And so they would be able to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. But the Jews were weak. They knew they would have to partner up with somebody, presumably distant relatives. And this is where the Hagarites or Hagarenes, come into the picture. Both the Jews and the Hagarites, also called Ishmaelites, had the patriarch Abraham as their relative, as their progenitor, their father. The Jews thought of the Christians as oppressive because the Byzantines had banned the Jews from living in Jerusalem. And the Christians believed in the Trinity, which the Jews saw as polytheism, belief in three gods. Also, at this time, the Mary cult, the Mariolatry, of the idolatry involving the worship of Mary, was a growing movement. So the Jews felt that God would be on their side against the swinish Christians. If you are what you eat, then Christians were swinish, because didn't they eat pork? Pork is another name for swine. About the Hagarites, also called Ishmaelites, their relationship with Abraham, Hagar was Abraham's concubine or wife, and Ishmael was his son. So the Jews and the Hagarites forged an alliance. The idea was the Jews would finance the Hagarenes, their army, and so the Hagarene army, which would include the Jewish element, they would fight against the Christians and hopefully liberate Jerusalem, and the Jews would then take over Jerusalem and treat the Hagarenes with respect. And but the main thing was the Jews would get to rebuild their temple. But when the Hagarenes took over Jerusalem in 638 A.D., they reneged on their deal to turn the city over to the Jews and let the Jews rebuild their temple. They told the Jews that they should be grateful that they were no longer banned from Jerusalem, and that it was the Hagarenes that had helped them get their city back. So they should be satisfied with that. But the double cross did not end there. The Arabs refused to let the Jews rebuild their temple and proceeded to build a holy house, the house of God, of their own. Some Christian pilgrim visiting Jerusalem in the mid 600s. No, it was the 680s. Said that there was an Arab house of God already erected in the 680s. This was like 10 years before the Dome of the Rock was built, which was finished in 691. Now, when these Hagarite Arabs took over Jerusalem in 638, they were not known as Muslims. Some Christian from Edessa in Armenia wrote his impression of them, and he said they were called Hagarenes, or else they call themselves Hagarenes. So the word Muslim was not in use at that time, and they did not have the religion of Islam at that time. And but by 691, that was the first time that they had the Shadaha, which is the term they use for their motto. Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. When these Arabs took over Jerusalem, they did so without having to fight. There was no battle. The Christians in charge of Jerusalem agreed to turn the city over to them peacefully. And what this did was, this led the Arabs to think that they could get along with the Christians, and so what they did was they switched alliances. They had been allied with the Jews, and were totally against the Christians, because they, like the Jews, saw the Christians as polytheists and not pure because they ate pork, and so on. And so they saw themselves as more righteous than the Christians. But the Christians had prestige. They had great land holdings. They had the Byzantine Empire, and so it was very tempting to these Hagarenes to buddy up with the Christians, to the extent that they accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but not as the Son of God, because God is that would be anthropomorphic. That would make God too human. God does not have a son. He does not have a wife. And if he doesn't have a wife, how can he have a son? And so they sort of split the difference. In other words, they accepted part of Christian doctrine and rejected another part, and inserted their own doctrine. They did that on a regular basis, and going back all the way to the story of Isaac, Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac on an altar. The Hagarene tradition was which precedes Muhammad. I should add. The Hagarene tradition is that Ishmael was the son that was about to be sacrificed, and but then the angel intervened and stopped Abraham from slaying Ishmael. And so this idea of taking Jewish doctrine and then tweaking it and giving it a new look, splitting the difference. That goes back all the way to that doctrine. They even borrowed from Abraham almost slaying his son, and then the son was not slain. They took that theme and applied it to Christ's crucifixion. And they came up with the doctrine that Christ was almost crucified, but that at the end, the Romans crucified someone else. I think their doctrine is that Judas was crucified. I may be wrong on that, but it is in the Quran that Christ was not crucified. They took somebody, they crucified somebody that looked like Christ. Now, when the Hagarenes that later became Muslims reneged on their promise to let the Jews rebuild their temple, they may have been familiar with Psalm 83, which mentions the Hagarenes, among other people, other tribes or nations that were warring against the Jews way back in ancient days, and when the time of Psalm 83 was written. And part of that psalm mentions these other people that I think they stole the house of God from the Jews, something to that effect. And basically that's what the Hagarenes did. They built their own temple, well, just a temporary structure to lay claim or make a stake, to serve as a stake that showed that that's what their intention was, to build a real temple later on. At some point, they decided that they were a third force. There were the Jews, and there were the Christians, and the Hagarenes decided they had enough religion to constitute a third religion, and so now they had two lands. They had the original land, which was Petra, which was also called Becca, and that was in the area which is now Jordan. And it was the Nabatean kingdom. And the Nabateans were the ancestors of the Arabs. They had the language and the writing that the Arabs later adopted. And so that was their holy city. And so much so, it's documented. It's proven. It's a proven fact that Petra was the original city of these Hagarenes before they became Muslims, and they kept that particular um, characteristic up until 725. And every single mosque that was built facing Mecca, not Mecca, but Petra. And after something like 822, all of the mosques faced Mecca. Now what happened was, Petra was destroyed in an earthquake, and so they say, well, God is no longer there. It can no longer serve as the holy city. And so they switched over to Mecca, mainly because the name was close enough to Becca that they would serve as this holy city. And there is actually evidence in the Quran where Petra is described, because it was a place of olive trees and farming and valleys and a trade route. And but people that have studied Mecca have found out it was not any of that stuff. So the description of the city, the holy city, that's given in the Quran was actually switched over. It comes from an earlier city other than Mecca, because Mecca does not have certain things that Petra did have. But now the Hagarenes also had Jerusalem. I want to emphasize that the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem was built over the Temple Mount, depriving the Jews of that location to prevent them from building their own temple. The Arabs double-crossed the Jews, and the Jews must have been hopping mad. And the alliance, the friendliness between the Arabs and the Jews was gone. And the Arabs, at that point, they tried to buddy up with the Christians to a limited extent. And then when they had to have a holy book of their own to flesh out this new religion. And if you look at the Quran, this video on YouTube, I just saw it the other day. They were told of like 4 stories. I don't remember them all, but one story was about Abraham being spared from a fiery death. Nimrod tried to kill Abraham in a fire, and I think somehow Allah saved Abraham. Now this is a story that predates Islam. It's like 100 or 200 years older than Islam. And it's like from the 500s or 400s. And it's a Jewish apocryphal book, apocryphal story. And this is the sort of stuff that was was thrown into, not thrown, but put into the Quran. The Arabs were willing to take stories that were not considered important enough to be put into the Bible, and they put them into the Quran. And there was a story, a Christian-based story, of an infant or a child, Jesus, who takes some clay and forms shapes this clay into birds, and then tells the birds to fly. And this clay magically turns into real birds. And this is a story that predates the Quran, but it's in the Quran. So the Quran has a habit of plagiarizing these stories that predate the Quran, and they put them in the Quran. That shows you the mentality of these Hagarenes. They were trying to whip up a new religion, not from scratch, but from these sources that are already there. And then they had the nerve to claim that Allah gave these stories to Muhammad between, before he died in 632. If he died then, that's what the Quran says. But the Quran, as we know it, was only finalized something like in the year 800. At least 100 years after the supposed beginnings of Islam. This woman, her last name was Crone. She wrote a book about the origins of Islam back in 1977, and she started a whole movement of deconstructing the origin of Islam. Today, Professor or Dr. J. Smith is doing a lot of that, and Dan Gibson is doing fantastic work showing that the early mosques were all facing Petra, which is a really big deal. None of that is given in the Quran. And why is that? Because they hid it. They hid it. They're hiding it. They're hiding other stuff. But I want to emphasize that the story of Abraham about to sacrifice Ishmael, this is in the Quran, but it predates the Quran, and it really is it's a glimpse of the true origin of the sect that became the Muslims. The sect was originally named Hagarenes, and later the name switched over to Muslims. And they had they got this new religion. Instead of Hagarism or Ishmaelism, it became Islam. And as far as the name of God, I think J. Smith or someone else was identifying. There's two names of wives of a god. Two women's names. Two women. A female demon. Their names are in the Quran, and someone has said that these are actually two wives of the god of the Hagarenes. The people that lived in the Nabatean area, Petra, again. And that again ties the Quran or the Hagarenes, the Muslims, back to Petra, and shows that they're hiding their origin. And this god actually had these women as wives originally. The Nabatean religion. Okay, I should identify the verses in the Quran about these two women that are the names of the wives of this god. This is called the Satanic verses. That this Iranian author, that's the title of his book, and I forget his name, but he's world famous. The Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against him, saying that any Muslim is, he's soliciting Muslims to execute this man, to assassinate him. To assassinate him for writing this book, which is disrespectful to Islam, to the Quran. That was the reason Ayatollah Khomeini had. What I'm trying to say is that the origin of Islam is directly related to the desire of the Jews to regain their city. And they did so by hooking up with the Hagarenes, who later became the Muslims. And so the origin of Islam is directly to be laid at the feet of the Jews, ironically enough. Now, I've listened to Dan Gibson. I've listened to Jay Smith. I listened to Tom Holland a little bit. And I read book reviews of this book by this woman named Crone, a Danish American, a tremendous woman. She's dead now. And, she deserves heaven, I swear. Okay. But none of these people so far, I haven't really, gotten deep into their work. But none of these people so far say that Islam is directly related to the Jews' desire to regain Jerusalem. They probably do say that somewhere in their books. But how could these Hagarenes, a low-life tribe, so to speak, considered pretty low, considered by the Christians that wrote about them as they began their conquest of the Holy Land and, later on Egypt and so on. They considered them barbarians. They were unlettered men. Mohammed was an unlettered, illiterate merchant. How could these people think they were good enough to start a new religion? Well, like I said before, they looked down at these Christians because the Christians were polytheists, and they thought of themselves as superior to these polytheists because they, like the Jews, their Jewish cousins, they believed in one God, so they thought they were superior to the Christians, and they looked down on the Christians for eating pork, and somehow they thought of themselves as more righteous than the Jews and the Christians, and they said, we can do it. We can whip up a new religion, and they sure enough did, and it's been going strong for like 1,400 years. If you want to email me with any comments, I would appreciate it. And, okay, joegrace@gmail.com. JOEGRACE GRACE gmail.com.